This is Movie Time with Chris. And it is Star Wars Day. This is going to be my last video that I'm doing for the day, giving people a little bit of a break from that. But, still doing some stuff on Instagram, so, follow me there for that. But anyway, in this video, which has been much anticipated by myself, we are discussing the theory of Darth Jar Jar. Now, I wanted to talk about this probably a few months ago. I actually have the images that I downloaded already on my computer to talk about this topic. And it was last week when I was trying to figure out what to do for the next coming days, when I realized Star Wars Day was coming, that I realized no better time than the present to talk about this theory of Darth Jar Jar. Now, this theory, if I'm not mistaken, first appeared on Reddit in 2015. And it took the Star Wars following by storm. Essentially, it states that Palpatine was not the ultimate bad guy, that there was another Sith Lord behind it all, the real man behind the curtain, pulling the strings, and it was Jar Jar Binks. Now, there are multiple videos on YouTube already discussing this, so be sure you check those out as well, because they have amazing content, and some of them go into more depth. Some of them have some other examples that I don't really agree with, but check those out as well, just to be well informed. I'm not sure if you could still find the original Reddit post, but if you can, check that out. So anyway, this came out in 2015, and even though in previous videos I had stated it was 2016, it was actually 2015 when I did start seeing YouTube videos relating to this topic. And I remember that because I was all hyped about episode 7 coming out in theaters, and I was all Star Warsy and watching Star Wars stuff on YouTube all the time, and I stumbled upon this, and it changed my outlook on the prequel trilogy forever. So, there are little things that happen throughout the trilogy, the prequel trilogy, that lead you to believe that Jar Jar is a Sith Lord. And it's strongly believed by the Star Wars community that, well, most of the community that I talk to anyway, or have heard of, that this was George Lucas's intent to make Jar Jar the bad guy. The name Jar, looking at Webster definition, to have a harshly disagreeable or disconcerting effect. To have a harshly disagreeable or disconcerting effect. Jar Jar, two times. Also, if you go off the fact that Star Wars, the whole story is based heavily on mythical lore and history, and that's where George Lucas got the inspiration for these things. There is a book, I can't remember the name of it right now. Someone comment in the comment section below what the book was. But in it, there's a character whose name is Bink, and he's like a court jester, and ultimately he ends up being a manipulative mastermind. So when you take Jar and Bink and you get Jar Jar Binks, it points to the fact that, yeah, a court jester acting like a bumbling fool who's actually manipulating everyone and is the mastermind behind it all. That's what you get with Jar Jar. Physical facts. Yes, you could say Jar Jar has yellow eyes, and all the Sith have yellow eyes. We see that with the Emperor. We see that with Anakin. We see that with Maul. But if you really watch episode 1 all the Gungans have yellow eyes. So it could stand out, but at the same time, it doesn't. But yes, Jar Jar does have yellow eyes like the Sith. We see in episode 1, Jar Jar perform this superhuman feat of like a 20-foot dive into the water after he kind of centers himself. Well, who else is able to do these great jumping leaps that we see? Jedi, Sith. There are no other characters that we ever see perform these tasks throughout any of the 11 Star Wars films. We don't even see the other Gungans do it in their great battle against the droids at the end of episode 1. You would think that those abilities would come in handy when battling droids. But we don't see that. But we see Jar Jar do it. Another example. In Return of the Jedi, before Luke is about to be pushed into the pit, we see him and he steps off, turns, grabs the board, jumps up, does a flip, and lands behind the characters. Who else do we see do that? Jar Jar. In episode 1, we see Jar Jar do a similar move here. We see him stepping off the ledge, turning, grabbing onto the ledge. And if you follow the path, the line of sight of the droid that's there and actually fires at Jar Jar's position, he then turns to see Jar Jar is actually located over here. Jar Jar stepped off, turned, grabbed the ledge, did a force jump, and landed on an opposite side. And you can't say that that's a continuity error because this is all animated. Why would the animators put that in if it wasn't supposed to be canon? You know, that's not an actor that made the mistake and turned and looked or missed his mark in landing in the cutscene and actually jumped off the wrong side. No, this is all animated. So obviously these animators knew what George Lucas wanted and had Jar Jar perform that same task that Luke did here. Jar Jar. Banished from the Gungan underworld, the Gungan city, and is left to kind of roam the surface of Naboo. Has the entire planet to roam. And where does Jar Jar end up? In the one location where there are Jedi. Who else does that? Where else do we see that? Yoda. When Luke goes to find Yoda, Luke lands in a swamp. Literally, in a swamp. And who just so happens to be there? Yoda. Yoda has the whole planet to himself, but manages to be in the one location where there is a strong Force user. Another tie between Star Wars movies, how the prequel trilogy is supposed to mirror, or in George Lucas's words, rhyme with the original trilogy. When we first meet Yoda in Empire Strikes Back, 1980, he's a fool.
Looking? Found someone you have, I would say.
Right.
Help you I can. Yes.
I don't think so. I'm looking for a great warrior.
Oh, Great warrior. Force not make one great.
Put that down. Now we... Hey! It's my dinner!
How you get so big eating food of this kind?
Listen, friend, we didn't mean to land in that puddle, and if we could get our ship out, we would, but we can't, so why don't you just...
not get your ship out?
Hey, get out of there!
No!
Hey, you could have broken this. Don't do that.
You know, we see him acting ridiculous. He's goofy. Did you know that Goofy was the inspiration for Jar Jar? A goofy character. Playing dumb around Force users to trick them, but is ultimately the master. Jar Jar. Yes. Also, Jedi and their fighting technique based heavily on the samurai of ancient Japan. Well, Asia and their many fighting techniques that we've all come to appreciate with, you know, karate, kung fu, jujitsu, ninjutsu, all those different things. Well, there is another form that has a common name, and we've seen it in a Jackie Chan film, of drunken boxing, where you pretend to be, you know, drunk and stumbling, but you're really not. You're aware of everything that's happening, and you're doing this to deceive your enemy. Who acts like that? It's just stumbly and, oh, Jar Jar. Jar Jar acts like that throughout. Does Jar Jar, and again, he centers himself before he does that force leap. Is Jar Jar trained in ancient ways? I think he is. I think he is. Another telltale sign that we see Jedi use all the time. The mind control.
Credits will define.
You don't need to see his identification.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
There's always a hand gesture when they're manipulating someone's mind. Who else do we see use hand gestures when they talk? Jar Jar. And usually with some kind of a promotion or just in general. Now, if you wanted to hide the fact from other Force users that you can use the Force and you can manipulate people's minds, how would you do that? You would talk a lot with your hands so that they don't read the fact that you're putting thoughts in their head. No one would be the wiser to the fact that you're swaying your hands across and putting thoughts in their mind if you're always talking with your hands. Great tactic by Jar Jar. And we see that. Manipulating everyone in the Senate to give powers to Palpatine. We even see it briefly with the pod race. There's a scene when, you know, nothing great is happening, yet Jar Jar's excited with the way that Anakin is, you know, proceeding in the race, and Jar Jar goes, "Here he comes!" At the start of the third and final lap. So everyone in the stands follows suit and does it too, sharing the excitement that Jar Jar has spread through them. Yeah. Jar Jar is a Sith Lord. And the mirror comparisons between him and Yoda with episode 5 Yoda and episode 1 Jar Jar are uncanny. They really are. You also see Jar Jar mouthing words that are said by other characters while they're saying it.
The Queen wishes it. She's curious about the planet. The Queen wishes it. She's curious about the planet.
As if Jar Jar's putting those words in their mouth.
Well, I don't know.
Now you could say Jar Jar's an aquatic creature on a desert planet. Maybe his mouth is dry. My mouth goes dry all the time. You guys know that. But then you would see Jar Jar constantly. But you don't. You see him do it those 2 times. And it's not like he's just opening his mouth and follow his lips. He's mouthing the words that are being said. Again, Jar Jar's animated. Why would the animators put that in if it wasn't something important to the story? Jar Jar's the Sith Lord. Jar Jar was supposed to be the big reveal that mirrors the original trilogy, with Darth Vader saying,
You killed him. No. I am your father.
blew everyone's mind. That's what we were supposed to get in the prequel trilogy. Jar Jar blowing everyone's mind, being the Sith Lord. Jar Jar's the Sith Lord. He is. So, there's been talk of a deleted scene where Palpatine is thanking Jar Jar for giving him all the power of the Senate. There's a quote of George Lucas where he's having a discussion where he says that Jar Jar is the key and they have to get Jar Jar to work. And I feel like, yes, there was a lot of backlash at the time about Jar Jar. People didn't understand what George Lucas, what his vision was. But that's understandable. These people aren't George Lucas. They didn't create this great universe. So because of their misunderstanding and the backlash that Lucasfilm received, he changed the story. And instead of Jar Jar being the big bad guy, we got Count Dooku, who was never heard of before, never talked of before, but they had to throw him in, so they threw him in. I think it would have been great to have Jar Jar be the bad guy. Yeah, then you can be like, okay, well, Palpatine had Maul. If it's always just 2, how could there be more? Well, Palpatine had Vader, but he wanted Luke. If you go by the games, Vader had an apprentice that he was trying to get. Even in the sequel trilogy, Kylo Ren answers to Snoke, but ultimately he wanted to get Rey to join him. We see Count Dooku do it. Even though Count Dooku was an afterthought, Count Dooku, who serves Sidious, tried to recruit Obi-Wan. Vader tried to recruit Luke. It's constant. So if Jar Jar was the real bad guy and Palpatine was his apprentice, of course Palpatine would want to recruit someone and train them so that they could overthrow Jar Jar. It fits. Now, I know that with what Disney has done with canon, they say that Jar Jar now is, in the Aftermath books, Jar Jar is back on Naboo and he's a street clown, a court jester. But who's to say that Jar Jar can't be Yeah, a court gesture, but looking for a Padawan. Looking for young kids, the same young kids that we see in The Last Jedi. You know, where the one kid has the Force. Maybe Jar Jar's doing that. Maybe Jar Jar's looking for a new apprentice. It's possible. Let's see it. There are so many people that agree with this theory of Darth Jar Jar and love this theory of Darth Jar Jar and want this theory of Darth Jar Jar. Disney, give us another movie and Jar Jar's been the bad guy. Give us that. You don't want to say that he's been the one pulling the strings all along, that he wasn't Palpatine's apprentice or master? Fine. Here's a way around that. You introduced Darth Plagueis in episode 3. Darth Plagueis, who trained Sidious. Darth Plagueis, who realized the power that Naboo had in its core. That's what they were mining. That's where the fight takes place between Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, and Maul in the undergrounds of Naboo, where they're harvesting this energy. Plagueis saw that energy. Plagueis was very smart, wanted to harness that, came to Naboo, stumbled upon Sidious, and trained him. Plagueis made many trips to Naboo to see Sidious, to train him, to give him lessons. Who's to say that on one of those trips, he didn't come across Jar Jar? Who's to say he didn't start training Jar Jar as well? Maybe he saw some kind of flaw in Sidious and said, okay, well, let me try teaching this guy and he'll be a better apprentice. We've seen it. The Sith are supposed to be a rule of 2, but they always have a contingency plan. Maybe Jar Jar was Plagueis' contingency plan. Maybe Plagueis was teaching Jar Jar the ways of the Force, the dark side. And maybe Jar Jar got a hold of some holocrons. Maybe Plagueis brought some to him and continued his learning through that. And now, in the background, Jar Jar has seen everything that has transpired, still followed Plagueis' plans by helping Sidious become who he was. Because Plagueis, had Sidious there. Plagueis made Viceroy Gunray who he was, had Palpatine in the Senate, helped Palpatine to become Chancellor. Jar Jar was just following in those footsteps and helped Palpatine to become the Emperor. So Jar Jar, also being a student of Plagueis, not related so much with Palpatine, but let's have him be a Sith Lord in the next movie. Everyone wants it. Give it to us. Those are my thoughts. Darth Jar Jar. Check me out on social media. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, blog. And you guys can always email me, movietimewithchris@gmail.com. But until next time, stay safe and may the Force be with you.